I noticed something recently. Though I'm a huge horror fan, many of my favorite works within the genre are all sort of cut from a similar cloth. I couldn't express my affinity for the Silent Hill franchise even if I wanted to, while so many of my favorite horror films and literature share similar atmospheric, artistic, or storytelling directions. But I couldn't quite figure out how to categorize these works. Most belong to psychological horror, no doubt, but at the same time I've seen countless psychological works that don't follow this formula. I thought about maybe calling it weird horror. The stilted dialogue of Silent Hill 2, the strange concepts of Junji Ito, anything made by David Lynch. But again, it's not all weird or outlandish. So eventually I settled on melancholic horror. When something is melancholic, its main distinguishable trait is a pensive sort of sadness. Pensive meaning to involve deep thought or reflection, anything with a kind of horror that you might consider subdued. It isn't screaming in your face or charging after you down a long hallway. It isn't often activating your fight or flight. Instead, it may be something lurking in the shadows, something mundane or ordinary, contorted specifically to fill you with unease. It might be enveloped in a thick fog, a reflection of the deepest recesses of our minds. But I noticed something else when observing my own tastes, that I'm not the only one drawn to this kind of horror. Actually, I'm one of millions, probably. I can't go an hour without seeing a TikTok of James running to Silent Hill with a caption like, "Dude's on the way back from Jersey Mike's after a 12-hour shift at the sawmill." And usually it's people my age behind these memes. Gen Z. The Zoomers. I wouldn't typically focus on something like that, chances are. You see a popular meme these days and we're the ones behind it. But something stuck out to me. Silent Hill 2. Why have we narrowed our obsession here when most of us weren't old enough to even remember its release? In fact, the game at the time was something of a disappointment to the general audience and critic, and gained its masterpiece status in the years following. Then I noticed most of my favorite works sort of did the same thing. We can look at Kubrick's The Shining, which was lambasted on release only to later be held in such high regard. Jacob's Ladder was met with good reviews, but gained its status as a must-see psychological thriller later down the line. A work of art being overlooked on release, only to later be recognized for its quality, is not a new phenomenon. I'm well aware of this. All we need to do is look to our friend Van Gogh for one of the more monumental examples of this throughout history. I'm more interested as to why young people my age have gravitated toward these works, obsessed over them in a way maybe more so than the people who were our age did when these works were initially released. To tell you the truth, it's been shockingly difficult to find any sort of article, study, or think piece regarding Gen Z that wasn't written from an outside source, someone who does not belong to the age bracket. There's all kinds of noise from every direction. Those like Jonathan Haidt, a social psychologist from NYU's Stern School of Business, believe that we're hopeless, coddled, fragile, buried in our screens, unable to operate in the real world. Then there are others like Vicky Phillips who combated Haidt's opinions in Forbes, arguing that Gen Z is perseverance personified, in reference of course to being raised by a global pandemic in a world of political turmoil and a culture of violence in schools. In truth, I think we lie more toward being perseverance personified, but suffer from a sort of crisis of confidence. The doom and gloom that Haidt attributes to Gen Z, interestingly enough, I hear from a lot of my friends and people close to me when describing themselves, though I rarely see such traits in action. What I probably hear most, however, as an older Zoomer with older Zoomer friends, is that a lot of us are lonely, despite being digitally interconnected at nearly all times. Zoomers, being the first generation to have lived entirely in the internet age, know best the consequences of social media. Too much can be harmful. You will almost always run the risk of being exposed to something traumatic, leading us to being perhaps the most desensitized generation in history when it comes to viewing violent or gruesome acts. We're experienced, and so we know when we've seen enough and need to log off for a bit. However, it's my belief that with the integration of technology in schools and the workplace, escaping our digital connections is only becoming more and more difficult. We know when we've had enough, but there are times when technology simply won't let us disconnect. Modern society runs through digital interconnectivity, and it's becoming only rarer that we can just walk away from our screens. Earlier, I referred to writings regarding Gen Z from people like Jonathan Haidt and Vicky Phillips as noise, and I mean this exactly how it sounds. Every tweet, every Instagram post, comment, article, think piece, YouTube video, yes, even the one you're watching right now, is noise. And sometimes, this wall of sound slapping you constantly over the head can be far too much to bear. Now you may be asking, what does any of this have to do with horror? Well, I'm getting there. Victor Hugo, the famed author of works like Les Miserables and The Hunchback of Notre Dame, once said, "Melancholy is the happiness of being sad." There's a clear paradox there, and I'll do my best to describe it. It can be likened to listening to a sad song. What you're listening to is undoubtedly sorrowful, but the experience in some way brings a sense of comfort. In the context of melancholic horror, here too can a sense of comfort be found. When the digital wall of noise becomes too much for Zoomers, what can we possibly do for some reprieve from the buzzing? Well, I think it only sensible to want some kind of escape, a safe space from the noise, if you will, one so silent it can only be found in total solitude. A solitude found in something like the hotel from The Shining, or in the liminal spaces of the backrooms. At first, I thought it somewhat strange that in the foggy streets of Silent Hill I felt a sense of comfort, but as melancholy is the happiness of being sad, in a way, there is catharsis to be found in the fog. Growing up entirely in the digital age has not been easy for Gen Z. Past generations have undoubtedly faced their own issues as well. I'm not discrediting those who grew up in an age of civil unrest or in the clutches of a Cold War. Gen Z has an entirely unique experience, however. Ongoing conflict in the Middle East, the racial injustice our parents and grandparents were not able to expunge, the relatively new phenomenon of horrors within our classrooms. Boomers had a saying in the hippie era, "Tune in and turn on," a plea of sorts for the general public to tune in to what's going on around them, get hip to the social change they were enacting, understand and bring to an end the horrors of war. What's interesting about this saying is the implication that there was an option to tune out and turn off. In today's digital world, many young people have lost the ability to, let's say, unplug. The wall of noise that is the internet is constant with or without you. Unlike our hairier generational predecessors, chances are if you want reliable news, you need to search for it. If you want to stay involved with your group of friends, you need to connect. If you're seeking help with schoolwork or a job, you must plug in. Times are rare when you can silence that wall of noise. Silent Hill 2 offers a horror experience unlike many other mainstream horror titles, even those within its own series. I find it at its scariest in confined spaces, but being outside in Silent Hill 2 offers quite a different experience. I can't speak for anyone in particular but myself, so I'll go ahead and say that I wasn't scared walking into town, or walking the streets. In fact, I felt a strange sort of peace, like I longed to live in this world where I was alone, enveloped in a blanket of fog, melancholic piano keys singing to the sound of my footsteps, safe from the constant buzzing of our digital society. It is cathartic to think of a total escape from the noise. The same can be found in the internet craze that is the backrooms. Personally, I prefer an iteration without a goofy-looking monster lurking in the shadows, just an impossible setting with a tinge of nostalgia. These images usually communicate a sort of deafening silence. For young people, perhaps, a reminder of a time when the internet was still in its infancy, before it ruled every waking moment of our lives. The nostalgia communicated within these works is odd. Yearnful, but you know you probably shouldn't get stuck there. Creepy, but comfortable in some way. Now, I know what you may be thinking. There are all sorts of meanings to be taken from the aforementioned works. You might be drawn to melancholic horror for some entirely different reason than to escape our digitally ruled world. But when looking for the connection between Gen Z and subdued horror, I thought back to one of my college courses from a few years ago. It was an English class, but the professor put a spin on the subject matter. We focused on horror and history, more specifically, how the most popular works in horror have always mirrored society's fears. Our old friend Dracula was wildly popular in the early 20th century, seeing adaptations of his story grow along with the medium of film as a whole. I'd like for you to think of Dracula. Picture him. Now, if your first thought was a pale-skinned, jet-black hair, clean-shaven with a long face and nose, and a vague accent, you would be imagining Dracula in arguably his most popular form. This image of the vampire was popularized in the 1930s, thanks in large part to Todd Browning's classic film, released earlier in that decade. If the theory that popular horror mirrors society's greatest fears is correct, then we must observe the 30s. What sort of fears would the people of that time be facing? Well, I think we would have to look at this period as the transition between world wars. Now, I have a degree in English and creative writing, not history, so bear with me if I end up making some overgeneralizations of the events of the decade. Would it be a far-fetched assumption to say that the American public would have held some fear in regard to the mysterious Eastern European man, who slaughters those that wander into his faraway land? By the late 1930s, World War II was in full swing, and until the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, the majority of the American public was against becoming involved in the action. The aftermath of the bloodshed in the First World War left the United States a little scarred, a little hesitant to join the fighting in Europe. Dracula was this fear reflected on film, further evidenced by his appearance and accent being distinctly European. Bram Stoker's original novel did not feature that same vampire. Instead, Dracula was a tall, pale man, with a long white mustache, red eyes, and hairy palms. Dracula is not the only example of horror mirroring fear. We can look at the waning hippie movement being met with 1973's The Exorcist, a film about a possessed little girl conveniently released at the end of a movement which specifically butted heads with Christian beliefs. How about Fatal Attraction, the femme fatale film released in the midst of rising wages for women as well as greater presence within the workplace? The slashers of the late 70s and early 80s coming at a time when the great counterculture of the 60s was dying, and along came the Reagan administration to set the youth straight. I wanted to know what our favorite horror was reflecting back to us, and when observing Gen Z's propensity for the melancholic, I could only think of our completely unique circumstance, being raised entirely in the digital age. According to a few studies I found when researching Zoomers, it became clear that a larger number of us than ever before are dealing with feelings of loneliness and hopelessness. A larger number of us than any generation believe that social media has greater negative effects on mental health than positive. So many of us feel as though we get lost in the wall of noise that is the internet. However, I'm not here to tell you that we're doomed to fall to the evil forces online. This is where we return back to the quote mentioned earlier describing Gen Z as persistence personified. You see, despite so many Zoomers feeling as reported in the studies I found, it was also reported that we, more than any other generation, are aware of the positive effects of social media and how to use these platforms for the better. We are more considerate of others online on average than any generation and are more likely to stick up for those receiving prejudiced or racist remarks. We are also the most self-aware when it comes to mental health and more willing to receive help both on or offline. A more direct portrayal of the modern fear of the digital age comes from one of my all-time favorite shows, 1999's serial experiments Lane. However, it doesn't much fit the theme of horror that we're speaking about here, so I've decided to save Lane for a future video, and I hope you'll join me for it. For my fellow Zoomers, whether you enjoy being lost in the fog of Silent Hill, traversing the unknown in the backrooms, or diving into the depths of analog horror, I'll say I'm proud of us in our ongoing journeys into adulthood. Stay persistent and prosper. Please let me know what draws you into your favorite melancholic horror works, or what kind of horror is your favorite. if the subdued isn't quite for you. And I'm not leaving you out, millennials. I want to know what you're into as well, and your feelings towards what I discussed here, but I'm going to wrap up. Have to stop rambling eventually, you know? Let me know if there's anything you want me to dive into next, and yeah, see you next time.